Hello, my lovelies, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds, and welcome back to the His Dark Materials Retrospectives. Now, this is my favourite of the books. This is The Subtle Knife, which is the middle book, the second book in the series. It's my favourite for a number of reasons. This is really where the story just kicks off, not only in terms of its back mythology, the pace of the thing. This story just rollicks along, but it does a wonderful, wonderful thing where it totally inverts expectation at the beginning. At the very beginning of this book, we are not in Lyra's Oxford. We are not even in any of the sort of ancillary dimensions or realities that she's been wandering. We are in our Oxford. We are in this reality, and we're following an entirely different character. We're following Will Parry, who's sort of like... I suppose in many respects, he's this world's equivalent of Lyra. He's a young man who's from an interestingly problematic household. His father is absent. We learn that his father he was some sort of researcher, some sort of maybe an archaeologist or a geographer of some description, who went off on some travel somewhere and never came back. He never came back. And his mother, there's a really interesting aspect to Will's story in the sense that you don't often get portrayals of mental illness in children's stories, not in an overt way anyway, and certainly not to any great depth. But Will's mother clearly has either some sort of neurological condition or a social condition of some description. She is mentally unwell and often exhibits this unwellness in the form of a disconnection from reality. There's a certain degree of paranoia, which actually turns out to be justified. But there's also these moments of a lack of lucidity where she doesn't really know where she is or what she's doing, and she seems to wander around without any recourse to her own safety or anything to that effect, or even knowing where she is or what she's doing. It's a really interesting, complex look at mental illness, and it places this immediate tension on Will. It makes him a really interesting character because again, like Lyra, he's only a child. I think he's 12, 13 at this point, so not old at all. And as well as all of the other normal tensions of being a 13-year-old in postmodern UK, he has his mother to take care of. What this has the effect of is removing him from everyone else. It removes him from culture, it removes him from like the school system. It removes him from being a boy like other boys. It makes him particularly interesting and unique. And that seems to be a driving force for him, as well as his eventual connection to Lyra, which initially looks like total circumstance. It looks like it's completely circumstantial. They more or less meet by accident, and then become very much a duo throughout the course of the rest of the story. There is an immediate sort of synchronicity between them. They are, like Lyra, Will is shunted from the normal experience of childhood by a number of factors, and there is a certain overlap between them. There is an understanding between them in that regard, to the point whereby Will accepts things about Lyra and even about the wider world. I mean, there is a point where he accidentally just stumbles through into another reality. There is a door open in our Oxford that's just been accidentally left open, basically, and it leads through into another reality, not into Lyra's Oxford, but into the same reality that Lord Asriel opened a doorway to at the climax of the Northern Lights, aka the Golden Compass if you're from the US. And as a result, Will ends up wandering around this very beautifully drawn other reality that, like Lyra's Oxford, is not quite like ours. There are subtle similarities, but also very, very profound differences. Like, for one thing, there are no adults in this reality, and it's actually quite strange. The town or the city into which he emerges is kind of desolate, but the city itself is architecturally sound. It's not as though there's been a war or anything like that. It's not as though there's shelled out buildings or anything like that. Everything is sound. There's a certain Mary Celeste quality to it. But the children are still there. And what we learn is that some phenomena occurred, some cataclysm occurred in this reality that has allowed creatures called spectres to seep through. And it's hard to tell what the spectres are, but they leave children alone up to a particular point, up to the point where they become adults, essentially. When they become adults, children are then able to see the spectres, and the spectres are attracted to them and prey upon them. And what they seem to do is they leech them of all they are. It's almost like they've been severed, like the children in Lyra's reality that have been subjected to having their demons removed. All of their animus, all of their sense of self, all of their personality is cut away, and they just become these basically zombies. They are more or less zombies. So the spectres are linked directly to the phenomenon of demons and the phenomenon of dust, but the story doesn't really explicitly describe how as such. It's a really beautifully drawn series of concepts, and the way Will and Lyra are thrown together in these states of extremis where they end up sort of hopping from one reality to another is absolutely beautiful. Meanwhile, you've got these really interesting subplots happening in Lyra's Oxford. Lyra happens to encounter because she goes to that version of Oxford in search of something familiar, and she happens to encounter a researcher by the name of Mary Malone, and Mary Malone is this very unusual academic who is researching sort of theoretical physics, I suppose you could call it, but it's theoretical physics that broaches on lots of very strange concepts. So there are notions of metaphysics in it, married to the concept of quantum physics. She's developed an engine that it seems to be able to measure dark matter, which Lyra and her reality called dust. What Pullman does is he creates an overlap between the actual very real quantum concept of dark matter that exists in our realities, and is an actual thing. It is an actual concept. And between the notion of dust. And when Lyra encounters this engine, like the alethiometer, the compass that measures truth, which is one of the driving MacGuffins, I suppose, of the story, it responds to her. Not only does it respond to her, but it seems to respond to her in a conscious way. It's as though the way it communicates is through these patterns of like particulate pixels on a screen that look like dust, and they form into different patterns when Lyra is hooked up to it. It's really fascinating. It's almost as though the universe, reality itself, is communicating with her, and that feeds into this wider metaphysics that occurs throughout this book. Meanwhile, you've got other subplots happening in Lyra's reality where the Magisterium is responding to what is essentially Lord Asriel's grand blasphemy, because he has opened a rift in reality, and everyone can see it. The thing is, he's left it open, and everyone who wants to go and look can see this other reality through the rent that he's opened. And suddenly, the Magisterium are scrabbling madly because it is antithetical to all of their theology, to everything they've prescribed, to everything they've used to keep Lyra's reality under its thumb. So suddenly, the Magisterium becomes very aggressive, and it starts taking the fight to the forces of that world, which it perceives as opposing it. So not only is it hunting down Lyra, it's also hunting down Lee Scoresby and his hot air balloon. It's hunting down the bears, the northern bears. It's also hunting down the witch characters, Serafina Pekkala and her coven of witches. All of them are subject to some actually quite horrendous violence, which is quite profound for a children's book. You know, Pullman doesn't really pull his punches in this. If you'll excuse the inadvertent pun there, he really doesn't pull his punches when it comes to depicting how violent these traditions and institutions are. He actually refers, because of course the magisterium is it's an analog for the Catholic Church in our own timeline, in our own reality. And what Pullman does is he refers back to history to portray what the magisterium is like when it feels as though its authority is threatened. He refers to the incredible genocides and pogroms that occurred when the Spanish Inquisition, for example, was in full force, or during those eras when the Catholic Church did incite mass pogroms across the face of the world. That's what he refers back to, and that's what he's drawing parallel with here. He has this incredible distaste for enshrined authority, and he's really trying to portray that in a metaphorical way for children here that shows them what authority is like when it's threatened. It's a warning in many respects. It's not didactic, it's not sort of finger wagging, but it is a warning. It is telling children the opposite of what C.S. Lewis prescribes in his books. Whereas C.S. Lewis prescribes bowing to authority and doing as you're told and not even thinking outside of parameters, Pullman basically says, look, if you allow institutions that assume authority to rule over you, to prescribe upon you, they will destroy you anyway. Eventually they'll eat you anyway when it becomes convenient for them to do so, or when it becomes inconvenient for you to exist, they will end you. Meanwhile, there's another this is the complexity of this book. It's like it happens in layers because of course it's dealing with multiple different realities and multiple different characters all occurring at once. You have these separate subplots all occurring. In that regard, it very much resembles structurally, it resembles things like Tolkien's The Two Towers, where you do have these like multiple different plots going on with multiple different paths and story arcs and characters. There's another one occurring in which Lord Asriel is attempting to... He's basically setting himself up as the new Satan, as the new Lucifer. That's his role. That's the role he's adopted in this new circumstance by ripping open the realities and sort of basically declaring war on the magisterium. He has basically sent up a multiversal flare to everyone in every universe, in every reality, who is oppressed by not only the magisterium, but the forces of what is called the authority. And the authority is this book's name for God. God is basically an antagonist in this story. This is where you start to learn this stuff. In this story, this is where it all starts to coalesce and come together, where you learn about the mythology that Lyra and Will actually are cast in, the sort of the mechanisms, the mythological mechanisms that are subtly guiding them to whatever destiny they have to fulfill. And each character, you learn, has been cast in this kind of biblical mythology, or certainly an eschatological mythology. And Azrael is Lucifer. He's not like metaphysically Lucifer. He's sort of almost like playing the role in this new situation. He's not, he's just a man. Lord Azrael is ultimately just a man, but he has the power, the influence, the authority to turn entire realities against the dictates of whatever their equivalent of the magisterium is. Certainly against the authority and its servants, which are very, very real. It's not the case that the authority is just an abstract thing, by the way. In a bizarre way, the magisterium is kind of correct in the sense that, yes, there are angels. There are these choirs of angels, and there is indeed a sort of God character in this multiverse. But the book takes great pains to point out that the authority is not the creator of everything. He's just another entity like everything else in reality. The angels are too. They're actually formed of dust. They're kind of like creatures of the abstract. And what Pullman demonstrates in this mythology is that the Authority and his angels are just the oldest forms of conscious life in the multiverse. They were the first ones to coalesce. And since that time have basically exercised their theological tyranny, not only across one reality, but across multiple realities. It's really fascinating. It's like flocking to Lord Asriel's side. You have all of these incredible mythological entities, including fallen angels. There are even fallen angels on Lord Asriel's side. What this book is setting up is a war. A war that is unlike anything. It's not just a war over a nation or a series of nations or even a world. It's a war across reality itself for the collective soul of reality. Whoever wins this war is going to dictate what all realities and all metaphysics is from this point on, basically. And into this mix you have Lyra and Will just basically stumbling about blindly, really. I mean, they follow the alethiometer for a little way, but even that can only guide them symbolically, and at one point that gets lost, actually. There is a kind of lesson that Lyra learns where she kind of goes against the alethiometer's advice, and as a result it gets stolen by someone that they then have to go through into Lyra's Oxford to sort of get it back. Meanwhile, there's another plot occurring where you've got Marissa Coulter, Lyra's mother, as we found out, trying to find her, trying desperately to hunt her down. And the wonderful thing about Marissa Coulter is you never know what side she's on. I don't even think she knows, ultimately. Throughout this book, Pullman takes incredible pains to make her contradictory, ambiguous, and oblique. You never know what she's doing. Is she in league with the Magisterium? Does she intend to bring Lyra back to them? Does she intend to basically sacrifice her to establish her own state and place within whatever new condition is going to erupt? You never really know. Or is she genuinely moved by being Lyra's mother? Does she actually want to save and help Lyra? It's hard to say. It's very, very difficult to say because she seems to flip between all of those different emotions. She's a really cool antagonist, is Marissa Coulter, especially for a children's book, because she's so ambiguous. You never know what she's doing or why, and that is wonderful. I mean, meanwhile, you've got this other plot going on with Will and Lyra, where they discover that the device that caused the emergence of the spectres in the reality that they end up in is this. It's such a simple thing. It's what the book it's eponymously what the book is named after. It's the subtle knife, which is a blade. It's just a simple knife. Oh, that's what it looks like. What it actually is a device that can cut through reality. It can actually cut through reality, and it's that's been opening the doorways between the worlds, which is allowing dust to sift through, as we discover, as the story progresses. It's kind of it's a strange thing, actually. It's a product of science. It's a product of the strange science of this other reality, but it's also very metaphysical. The knife itself, it's very metaphysical, and it chooses Will. Will is basically the next bearer of the subtle knife. There are marks that the bearers of the knife demonstrate, and one of them is that they lose 2 of their fingers from their I think their whatever hand they wield it with. And so Will ends up being the wielder of the knife and ends up using it to cut doorways between realities through which he and Lyra basically end up fleeing as they're pursued by various forces, by the Magisterium, by Marissa Coulter, by God knows what else. It's not only is it a really fast-paced, rip-roaring adventure with loads of really complex notions and conceits and ideas, notions of multiversality, alternative realities, alternative versions of physics and science, magic, occultism, theology, metaphysics. It is an incredible incredibly complex story, but it's handled in a really beautiful way. A really beautiful way, in that it doesn't ever at any point become confusing or tangled or too complex for its own good. It's a stunning read, The Subtle Knife. It's an absolutely stunning read. And it's the point for me where the metaphysics of this universe really takes off and becomes something not only counterposed, this is the thing about His Dark Materials for me. It was initially conceived as in a contrarian terms, I suppose, because it was designed to counterpoint or to undermine a C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia for all of their evils and conceits and ills. And it does do that, very much so. It does do that, but then it transcends that entire dynamic and becomes something far more beautiful than the Chronicles of Narnia could ever hope to be, because it's not cynical. It's not this cruel, cynical sort of parody or satire of the Chronicles of Narnia. It basically kicks C.S. Lewis's very narrow, very pedestrian metaphysics into the dirt, and establishes its own that is entirely more expansive and welcoming and inclusive and beautiful and various than anything Lewis ever imagined. It's quite astounding. It really is a beautiful thing, and I can definitely see why it was, until bloody Harry Potter came along, it was one of the best-selling children's series of books in this country at one time, and it certainly deserves to be so again. When we come back, my loves, we'll take a look at the very last book in the series, which is the Amber Spyglass. There are others. There are other stories in the sort of His Dark Materials mythology, if you like, that Pullman has written. And we may take a look at those, actually. We may take a look at those in another series. But when we come back, my loves, the Amber Spyglass. Until then, bye-bye.